Has anyone got any questions for the speakers? Yes.
Can I ask you, Mr. Gibb, if you're maintaining that there is this military service market, what were the, if you say the rates of pay were the same, what were the attractions then to shift opportunities for the market to exist?
Well, the rates of pay in the later 14th century were, for the period, quite high as a daily wage. So a mounted archer would get 6 pence a day, which is significantly more than the 3 to 4 pence that even a craftsman could earn. And also you get paid every day that you're contracted for, including Sundays and feast days, because the holidays weren't imposed. So there was an incentive for military service. Now, obviously, there's no standing army, so they can't rely on being paid that day in, day out for a prolonged period of time. So what I've worked towards this idea that they're taking opportunities to serve when they hear about them, because they're trying to specialise their industry of military service. So in some respects, they could be considered mercenaries, but they're mercenaries with national intent. So they're not going abroad necessarily to fight, but they're taking the opportunities where they've got them.
Was there some way in which they would learn of these opportunities? Because say I was serving in Dorset, why would I want to leave Dorset to go to France or go outside? What methods were there to say, come and join this retinue, rather than stay with the retinue which I'm already serving with?
Well, the military service, they wouldn't necessarily move from one retinue to the next. They wouldn't necessarily have employment for periods of time. And one part of the thesis that I'm trying to do is look at what were they doing when they weren't serving. So did they have occupations, being smiths, fletchers, whatever, even just day labourers. The methods of communication, I don't know for sure. There is one particular instance where there's a group of 4 archers and a man-at-arms who were in the Calais garrison in 1386, who all pop up in the 1387 expedition under the Earl of Arundel, which was a naval expedition off the coast of France. Which, although it's only one particular case, does suggest that there is some dissemination of news as to when they're recruiting, that they might send out people to advertise the fact they're recruiting to areas where they know they can get men from. In this case, the Calais garrison, they might hear about this and go, oh, there's a good opportunity here to actually earn ransoms and to take loot and plunder. So we're going to go and do that rather than sitting in Calais where it's not much is going on. There isn't a set market in the same way that you would talk about markets as an economist, but it was just trying to give this idea that it isn't tied into where they're from and who they have tenurial obligations to.
Sorry, Gary? Yeah.
My question for Sam as well. It was a really good paper, Sam. I really enjoyed it. Just a couple of things. You were talking about whether you were choosing where to serve. So you've got like I may have missed this, or you may have said it already, but you were saying because like the war is in effect a naval war in the second half of the 14th century, opposed to a land war. So therefore, obviously, how much are they choosing to? Obviously, they are going to sea. So, I mean, you probably can't answer this, but how far do you think that's influencing their choice of service? So that's the first thing.
So almost as if just because there's naval services, that's what they're doing.
So I mean, I'm probably asking an impossible question to answer actually. Sorry. The second thing is it's about their socio-economic status. Because of course, as we know, the pay for these guys is often quite, often in arrears.
Yeah.
So of course, the pay is obviously an incentive, but is there a sense that perhaps, the elite level of the peasantry, like yeomanry and stuff, they can almost afford to do without pay for service, and perhaps this is stimulating the service because of course, they're constantly serving because they need to keep going to keep funding their lifestyle, as it were.
I don't know if, with the information I've got, you'd be able to do the second part. One thing, again, I am looking at that isn't in this particular area was the rates that they're paying when I can identify them in the taxes. As a preliminary, in Essex and Dorset at least, they pay on average a higher amount than the county average for 79 or 81, because obviously the 77 tax was a flat per capita rate. So I've kind of used that as a proxy for economic standing, their wealth. The difficulty is where does it occur in their life? Because obviously if they're 15 in 79, they're less likely to have the money to pay a higher rate of tax. So it is difficult to identify. One thing I have been doing is when I've been picking out cases for people with multiple service, is trying to look at whether the service is before or after the tax. So you might expect that if they appear in the poll tax and then all their services after, that the poll tax would be a lower rate,
Sure.
and if it's before, you could expect it to be higher. As for the naval service thing, I honestly don't know. I don't know how I'd do that.
It's not going to be an impossible question to
Yeah.
answer.
Any? Remy? And then they'll come.
I have two points for my compatriot. Firstly, don't be scared. The English people are very welcoming. I can confirm. I just wondered whether you plan to do some comparison in the future, because just to me, it seems to me that the record of service is not maybe something that specific to. I observed it with the question of ransom and prisoners, where the soldiers put forward their record of service, comparing maybe with France.
Yes, exactly. In fact, it's part of my PhD. For my PhD, I will compare military services claimed in remission letters in the United States, but also in France and also in England, mainly during the period 1460 to 1480. So yes, and I will try to observe how it is possible to see if they claim a kind of a military service. For now, I've started to investigate French remission letters, and what I've observed for now is that some of them claim the military service, but there is a major problem, which is most of records of letters are abbreviated. They only contain the narration of the crime, but all the justification of the petition, for example, including the military service, are deleted, removed. So sometimes it seems that perhaps they just did not mention it, perhaps sometimes they mention it, or sometimes just that the chancery clerks did not think that it was interesting to copy, so it has been deleted in the
Within
archives.
the context of ransom, that often they really put forward at the start, it's kind of a
Exactly.
main element, 14th and 15th century.
Yes. What will be really, really interesting will be to make a longue durée comparison, I will say, in the Brodelian time, with a systematic comparison to all the 15th century. The major problem is that when you look at the Burgundian archives, there are only 750 remission letters. In France, for example, only for 20 years there are more than 5,000 of letters. So for only a study, a PhD study, for example, it's quite difficult to make a systematic comparison. But I think that it will be a great starting point for several further studies, indeed.
Adam, so
Yeah, a question for David. Do you think it's a significant problem with the database? And I was involved in its creation, so in a very minor way. The cultural work was done by people, but I was doing a PhD as part of the project. Is that for that particular comparison, the period before 1415, the principal area of conflicts in Wales and Munster source in particular is particularly badly served. And there are good reasons for that, which I won't bore you with. You can ask me after if you want. But that's one sort of qualification to that comparison, in that a lot of military service we've gone on by named individuals who will have served in 1415. We don't actually know about it because they weren't being paid by the Crown, and thus you don't get that thing. But it's interesting that the one particular interest of mine also is the foot arches, which in 1415 some of an anomaly. You know, they were very rarely recruited after about 1360.
Yeah.
So perhaps that's another point where perhaps the comparison isn't really valid, because they are recruited for a very specific reason and very specific occasion, and they're all Welsh.
Yeah.
So it's no lie, but just to be aware of it. But generally, I thought that was very interesting, because you've got a significant problem in that period before 1415 is it would use must as your core reference.
Yeah.
There's difficulty there. I mean, how do you think you can address that? Can we address that?
Very interesting. I was going to say, yeah. I can't think of any easy way to address it, to be honest. I'll devote some thought to it, but no, nothing springs immediately to mind.
It's from
I'm
my
afraid.
know, so I was hoping you might.
No, sorry.
Sounds benefit 76 for 2.
Sorry?
Sounds benefit 76 for 2. England.
76 for 2?
Yeah.
That's right, then you know.
45.
If I go to Beatrice, John, do you want to?
Yeah, Sam and David, very interesting papers, and I realise that you're both working within the parameters of a higher degree, but are you at some point in time perhaps looking at other sources, particularly local ones? And I'm thinking of things like manorial court rolls, deeds of title, wills, where these people turn up. I'm thinking particularly of Erpingham's will, where several of the people in his retinue in 1415 are actually named as executors in his will. Sir Edmund de Thorpe's will of 1417, before he goes on that campaign, actually mentions several beneficiaries who turn up in his retinue as well. Some of them are archers, by the way. So, you know, is that another sort of area that you're seeking to develop?
After you.
Yeah. Mine will be quite a short answer. It's an area I'd quite like to do, but my academic career is actually now taking me nearer in time, and I'm beginning to switch more towards the English Civil War, so I'm probably not going to spend much more time looking at this, but I mean, if I was, that would be a really nice area, I think, to take it.
Short answer is yes. The long answer is a fair few of them were considered, but it's just time limitations within a PhD. And costs of travelling around and things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing I've been thinking about recently, I'm quite keen on doing, is looking at the English soldiers in Ireland in particular in some more depth, which would obviously involve going into much more local detail, particularly around Dublin. And then, yeah, I believe there are different sources that could be used quite happily. You've mentioned the Earl of Arundel's estate survey. Things like that, again, could be used to look at different people. But for now, it was just restricting myself to a limited number of sources, which are quite big and large in scope, to achieve it.
Did Professor Schneeb, did you want to ask a question?
So I can another question about the use of the military service argument. You know, I think that. It's an argument you'll find in all the judicial contexts. You know? So not only in the letters of remission, and you have the same argument in the judicial records, for example, for the Parlement de Paris, and you will find that a soldier, a man-at-arms, or a nobleman use the argument and however, is condemned. So it's not sure that the argument is really efficient for the prince and so on. So what is really impressive is that you have only 38 letters of remission. The Burgundian army at this time was for 15 or 20,000 men strong. So it's really a minority. So I think that Charles the Bold was a repressive prince. You had the provost marshal at this time.
Yes.
His office is really efficient, and it's in hard justice against the men-at-arms. So I'm not sure that there is a policy of remission at this time. It's a question, it's not an affirmation. What do you think about that?
Naturally, it's difficult to answer this question. I do think that indeed 38 remission letters, that's not a very big issue considering the fact that the armies were far more larger. But even though it's not a very great big corpus of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters, although what I do think is that there is still a kind of pattern in the logic of granting these pardons. It's true, even though it's only 38 pardons granted to soldiers, on the other hand, these pardons are very similar to each other. They do not include war crimes, for example. And so, thereby, I do think that it's kind of a logic. And there's another aspect that I do think it's interesting, and I've not developed this question here. It's the question of the procedure itself, the process of granting remissions. What is interesting to observe, it's logical considering the military context of Charles de Gaulle, for example, but some historians estimate that the time for granting a remission is, in average, 1 entire year. But we can observe a kind of acceleration for soldiers. The procedure was accelerated. Most of the case, it was something like 2-3 months, and very frequently 1 month or even 2 weeks. Of course, it is, in the case of the armies of Charles de Gaulle, it's kind of logical, because the Duke was in his armies all the time. But it's also interesting because, for example, during the periods of the siege of the imperial city of Neuss, almost all remission letters were granted by the Parliament of Malines in the Low Countries. But Charles himself granted his pardons to his soldiers, and these pardons were located near to the city of Neuss. That's on the text. So I do think that even though it's not a very big amount of pardons, there's still a kind of logic in the granting process.
In the army, the competency of the Duke is in the ordinances
Yes.
for crime of for soldiers' crimes and so on. The Duke has to judge and decide. It was in the ducal legislation.
Yes, but on the other hand, what is also interesting is the question of the endorsement of the letter. We can argue that when a soldier committed a crime in the armies, it will be, for example, the provost marshal who had to endorse the letter because he had the jurisdiction to do it. But that's not the case. Most of the time, the remission has to be endorsed in the Parliament of Malines. So the soldiers had to leave the armies to go to the Parliament and, I don't know, to go back to the armies. But that's so. It's still surprising if the prince wanted just to delegate this power to the Parliament. He could, but he did not.
To go there and then one at the back and then back there. Yes.
Sort of loosely in the question that might draw all three together a bit. I wondered whether David or Sam had come across any evidence for a higher class of archer, a nicer sort of chap. What I did believe was that in my searches, I got an impression that in fact a lot of archers were younger members of good families, but there weren't the positions open, they weren't taking on men at arms, but they might be taking on archers at the moment and then you might convert later, that sort of idea. And the other thing that might surprised me about Quentin's thing was that most of the pardons I've been looking at in trying to identify archers locally, well not most of them, about half and half seem to be men at arms and archers in England. So, again, maybe archers are a better class of chap sometimes.
Depends when you're looking, I think, heavily, and what's going on. I mean, Gary's written quite a long paper on the mounted archers and how they appear to come from maybe a higher level of peasantry or yeomanry than say the foot archers, reflective of their increased pay, but also the equipment they needed, i.e. a horse, which aren't particularly cheap. But I think it's quite hard to draw concrete lines between different levels of person. I mean, particularly in England, it can be very difficult to draw even lines between aristocrats, gentry, down to the peasantry. There's quite a lot of blurring. So you could potentially, in some cases, I mean, it's been suggested that Cheshire archers in particular came from maybe poorer gentry families in some cases. And you get people like Robert Knowles, who allegedly started his career as an archer and ends up commanding an army somewhat unsuccessfully, but he got there. So I think it varies a lot. Coming back to the poll tax with the amount of tax they're paying, and particularly the 79 tax, where there's the schedule which kind of try to classify everyone in the country and into different ranks. Perhaps that might give an indication if I can see archers in commonly occurring in certain levels within that could give an indication towards that. But I think it's very hard to draw anything concrete from the materials we have, unfortunately.
I mean, I haven't found anything specifically. I mean, there are, I can't think of any offhand, but there are examples clearly where archers have changed role and moved into men-at-arms, and whether one could look at those, then look at what families they came from and do some analysis around it to find out if they have, as you say, started as they've come from better families, but then have started as archers and worked up. I don't know. But there are clearly examples where they have changed roles.
Yeah, it might connect to somebody mentioned at Anne's point about people clustering 2 or 3 together.
Yes.
The idea of better earlier in the list. Maybe you'd find that they were poorer gentry.
Yes, whether that positioning is significant somehow. Yeah.
Way into it. Thank you.
Can I go there and then to Remy? Did you want?
Yeah, for some, no, I like this idea of the archer being able to hop and so on, but just in your example of Westmoreland and like the Northern English trading, I would have thought that they would be actively discouraged from doing such a thing, and even really the 4th century with the rise and sort of trading again, and anything, well, the trend like the 1380s shows these people are being used for, archers being used for garrisons in southern Scotland or to protect the border again. But then I wondered then if there was a thing that you could extend that towards like the marches generally. I mean, is there actually discouragement from doing the kind of thing you're suggesting in the English North on the Welsh marches in parts of France, to stop them doing that, because actually that's not what we're trying for.
So you could suggest that the results for Scotland in that incident are due to either central encouragement or even encouragement from local landlords, local gentry or aristocracy who are responsible for maintaining the border and keeping the marches Scotch-free. I don't know off the top of my head. As a slight counterpoint, Shropshire doesn't seemingly have a high rate of service for Wales, but whether that's because there aren't that many musters for Wales, it could be. So, again, I'm not entirely sure. But it is an interesting point, and I think I'll have to bear that in mind when I'm considering everything, just in case. Thank you.
Remy and Gary, yes.
I have a question for David. I just wonder if maybe I'm ignorant here, but you said that if I understood well, the night banners were abolished. So how does that work? There was no more night banners, or I misunderstood?
No, that's what I understand. That yes, in 1640 something, they basically the post just ceased to exist.
16. Oh, okay, so much later.
Yeah, much later. Yeah.
Gary, did you want
It was just to respond to that thing about the Scottish issue of the Westmoreland thing. A lot of the garrisons work's been done by Cornell, I think his name was. And actually, a lot of the personnel of the English garrisons on the borders that actually come from the vast majority, don't actually come from the northern counties. They actually come from south of the Trent, and the reason is, the thinking is behind that is that actually it's easy for men who come from the region to desert. What they actually want is men who have got more chance of sticking out if they do a runner, basically. That could help explain why there's new findings, perhaps.
I mean, also you could tack on, I mean, getting from Westmoreland to, say, Berwick isn't a particularly easy journey, so again, coming from on the east coast, just taking a ship upwards or northwards would be relatively easy.
As you said, that garage boy does tie and remember the first experience. The soldiers that didn't deserve the ones that came from a very long way away.
Yeah,
a Welshman in Westmoreland is going to stand out. But lots of them.
Possibly a little, yes.
Well, the Yorkshiremen deserted en masse quite regularly.
Too busy playing cricket.
We've got time for one or two more if anybody wants.
That's not a question, it's from a position of ignorance. My understanding was that to become an effective archer, you would start at a very young age, maybe 8 or 9, and then you would train and train and train until you became a full-grown man, and it's a 12-year training. I don't know, but did the people who lived in the manors, did their kids have to do that training the same as all the peasantry? So were the lords' children who would have expected to be men-at-arms actually trained to be archers from a young enough age to be effective?
Well, I mean, archery was fairly common even amongst the men-at-arms in a sporting or hunting sense. It wasn't uncommon that they would also shoot. Regarding the training period, I think sometimes it has been a bit overstated. You don't have to start at a very young age. It takes time to develop. It's in the same way that building any muscle mass, so weightlifters or strongmen, anything like that, it takes time to develop. My fencing coach started shooting longbows, warbows, about 10 years ago, and now he can fire a sort of 100-pound bow fairly competently and get within a few metres of a stick. Sort of thing. So, you know, if you imagine he had 1,000 mates, it would be pretty effective. But it does take time to do. But at the same time, you could also suggest that people were more physically active in a lot of way than they are today. So perhaps you wouldn't have the same running time. But it is a consideration that people would need to do a certain amount of training. And there's a lot of debate about the different statutes which have made archery a legal duty or a legal obligation. Which would have theoretically carried weight across most of England. And also you've maybe got the traditions of people just doing it because that's what their parents do as well. But it is something to bear in mind that you couldn't just turn around and recruit longbowmen within a couple of months from scratch. You need a few years, unlike a crossbow.
Did you want to comment, Jenny?
If I just come back on that point, and as you say there are statutes of the 1363 statutes and its various reiterations, lays down practice on holidays and Sundays and butts. But I think there's a wider context here, and it falls into the context of the defence of the realm, really, and looking at the Statute of Winchester of 1285, whereby all able-bodied males between the ages of 16 and 60 are required to be available for military service, and are also required to provide themselves with arms according to their estates. And bows come into this in two different categories: the £5 and the lowest category.
I mean, there are incidences where men who were taken to muster were rejected as unfit for service. So obviously there was an awareness of this even amongst the officials who were doing the mustering. And there was this obligation, but how much did people follow it? I'm not sure.
Right.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was enforced, but it would be difficult if there were lots of people not doing it. Kind of things.
I think we better call it time there. It's a good place to stop, I think, because in ships the argument's always about tonnage. In longbows it's pound per square inch. And I feared we were going down that route there for a minute. But can I just put our hands together and thank you.